socially distanced choir at Canterbury Cathedral as the Archbishop calls for a better future for all in the Easter service. A political crisis in Jordan. The king's half-brother says he's under house arrest, accused of a plot to destabilise the country. Petrol bombs and hijacked vehicles in a second night of violent protest in a loyalist area of Northern Ireland.
On home water, it is still there as Cambridge have the victory.
And it's a double celebration for Cambridge, who win both the men's and the women's boat race. Good evening. The government is to trial so-called COVID passports in England to allow the safe return of sports matches, major events and nightlife. They'll show if a person has been vaccinated, has had a recent negative test or has developed antibodies after a previous positive test. The pilot will include the FA Cup final and will last until mid-May. Critics, including more than 40 Tory MPs, say that COVID passports will be discriminatory. Here's our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
England's National Stadium has been quiet for some time. But in the next few weeks, fans will be back at Wembley, cheering on teams as part of pilot schemes. And this year's FA Cup final will be used to trial COVID passports, where you have to prove your status before you're allowed in.
The key purposes of looking at this option is to see how it can enable us to open up, getting back to the things that we want to do. If this can be a tool to enable businesses to open sooner, because it could potentially mean that we can get rid of social distancing sooner, then that could mean that some of these businesses can open sooner. And certainly if they are open, then they can open more profitably.
This isn't just for people who've had the vaccine. It could be a few months before all adults have had both jabs. But status certificates would allow you to prove that you've had the vaccine, a recent negative test, or that you have natural immunity based on having had the virus in the past 6 months. Ministers have ruled out having to prove your status to get on public transport or to go to essential shops. And when pubs reopen in the next few weeks, you won't need one either. The government believes that COVID passports could be most useful for mass spectator events. If you've got to buy and take a ticket, why not an app as well that shows that you don't have the virus? But while you won't need one when these restaurants reopen in the next few weeks, ministers are still looking at whether they could be useful for reducing, maybe even removing social distancing. Dozens of MPs have expressed reservations though, and some senior Conservatives think widespread COVID passports are unlikely.
It's very different from anything we've done in Britain outside wartime. You know, we are not used to presenting papers to, or indeed the electronic equivalent, to go to the pub or to go to a football match. That's not what we think of as our freedoms. Our freedom is a freedom to have normal life.
This outdoor cinema in Liverpool will be part of test events in the next few weeks, looking at how to safely allow larger gatherings.
The opportunity to get back to full capacity, I think, is something that is so prevalent at the moment and is underpinning so many of the hopes that the events industry and entertainment industry has. So this scheme, we feel, is the right way to go.
Events will be tried out in Sheffield later this month too. Some here have reservations.
There is the thing about having your liberties taken away, which is really quite worrying about the health passports, but I also sort of get it.
How do you make people safe and feel reassured? How do you make sure that we still have that freedom?
The government will set out more details tomorrow. The reopening of society is continuing, but it could get more complicated.
And Nick is with me now. Nick, more details tomorrow. What can we expect?
Well, the Prime Minister will chair Cabinet in the morning, and it's expected ministers will sign off on moving to the next phase of unlocking in England. That's from a week tomorrow. It would mean non-essential shops reopening, pubs and restaurants allowed to serve outside, and haircuts allowed again. There will be a press conference tomorrow afternoon to confirm that. There will also be some more information about foreign travel. Now, don't expect firm dates or lists of countries we might be able to go to, but we will get the framework, which will be a traffic light system. Green list countries, you won't have to quarantine on return to England. Amber list countries, quarantine at home. Red list countries, you'd have to go to a government approved hotel for your quarantine. In an international context, COVID passports look pretty much inevitable. But as we know, they're far more controversial at home. And Boris Johnson's plans to go ahead with them are opposed by dozens of MPs, including many in his own party, and he does face the prospect of a significant rebellion if he does proceed with the plans in the medium term. There's also scepticism among some of the devolved administrations. These plans are for England at the moment, but it's not clear they would necessarily happen elsewhere in the UK. So the trials of domestic certificates will happen in England next month. They're for mass events. But ministers aren't ruling out coming back to this to look at how to remove social distancing later in the year in hospitality venues. And in that context, those COVID passports are definitely being kept on the table more widely.
Nick, thank you. Our political correspondent Nick Eardley there. Well, let's take a look now at the latest government figures on coronavirus. They don't include Wales and Northern Ireland because of the bank holiday. But in England and Scotland, there were 2,297 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That's the lowest number since September. That means on average 3,764 new cases were reported per day in the UK in the last week. There are 3,536 patients in hospital with COVID-19. 10 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. On average, in the past week, 35 deaths were announced every day, taking the total number to 126,836. On vaccinations, just over 97,000 people have had their first jab in the latest 24-hour period, bringing the total to just over 31.5 million people, and 5.3 million people have now had 2 doses. The traditional Easter service has taken place at Canterbury Cathedral, but with no congregation due to COVID restrictions. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, called for a better future for all as we emerge from the pandemic, urging private acts of charity and the maintenance of international aid. Meanwhile, the Pope, in his Easter message, urged an end to vaccine delays and their speedy distribution to poorer countries. Daniela Ralph reports.
Last year, at the height of the first lockdown, the Easter service came from his kitchen table. Today, the Archbishop of Canterbury masked for the procession to the altar.
Christ is risen.
Brought Easter back to Canterbury Cathedral. The choirs have been allowed to sing again, but the adults must be socially distanced. Those leading the service also had to abide by COVID protocols. And the Easter address drew on the experience of the past year.
We can go on as before COVID, where the most powerful and the richest gain, and so many fall behind. But we have seen and known where that leaves us. Or we can go with the flooding life and purpose of the resurrection of Jesus, which changes all things, and we can choose a better future for all. The overwhelming generosity of God to us should inspire the same generosity by us in everything from private acts of love and charity to international aid generously maintained.
In Rome, there were no pilgrims filling St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, eerily empty in a country that has partially returned to lockdown. The Pope took Mass and gave his global Easter blessing inside St. Peter's Basilica to a reduced congregation. He too focused on COVID.
Nello spirito di un internazionalismo dei vaccini, I urge the entire international community, in a spirit of global responsibility, to commit to overcoming delays in the distribution of vaccines and to facilitate their distribution, especially in the poorest countries.
For those who've not gone to church today, there have been online services, the way so many have worshipped over the past year. This is another Easter Sunday that feels so different. Daniela Ralph, BBC News.
The half-brother of the King of Jordan is being investigated for allegedly plotting with foreign parties to destabilise the kingdom. In a video sent to the BBC, Prince Hamza bin Hussein denied being part of any conspiracy, but he accused Jordan's leaders of corruption and incompetence. Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette reports now on this unprecedented crisis within Jordan's ruling family.
A young prince at the heart of a major royal rift. Hamza, 41 years old, graduate of Sandhurst in the UK, Harvard in the US. Now he says he's under house arrest.
All my friends have been arrested. My security has been removed. And the internet and phone lines have been cut. This is my last form of communication.
And in this video, passed to the BBC, rare public criticism from a Jordanian prince.
I am not the person responsible for the breakdown in governance, for the corruption, and for the incompetence.
Today on State TV, a dramatically different account. Prince Hamza and others accused of plotting to destabilize the kingdom.
The investigations monitored interference and phone calls, including with foreign parties, which discussed the appropriate timing to start steps to shake the security of our stable kingdom.
King Abdullah is said to be trying to resolve this within the family, an effort failing so far. So much is so unclear. There have long been some strains between brothers. Hamza was called the favourite of their father, the late King Hussein. There's a striking resemblance between them. But when the king lost his long battle with cancer in 1999, he chose his eldest son Abdullah to succeed him. Hamza became crown prince. 2004 was a pivotal year for the prince. He got married and was stripped of his royal title. The king made his own son second in line. Prince Hamza has expressed veiled criticism before, but nothing like this. This crisis in a quiet corner of a volatile region has rattled neighbours, including other Arab monarchies. They've rushed to back the king. And a kingdom already worried about discontent over an economic crisis made much worse by a painful pandemic. Now there's uncertainty over whether this is a family crisis or one which goes much further. Lise Doucette, BBC News.
Let's take a look now at some of today's other news. Police divers are involved in the search for a student who's been missing for nearly 2 weeks. Richard Okorogeye's family hasn't heard from him since he left his home in West London. The 19-year-old was last seen in CCTV footage recorded near Epping Forest. More than 100 people were arrested in central London yesterday during protests against the government's police, crime, sentencing and courts bill. Thousands of people took part in demonstrations across England despite COVID restrictions. In Bristol, 7 people were arrested after a large crowd was ordered to leave the city centre. 2 dogs which carried out an attack on an 85-year-old woman in Rowley Regis have been humanely destroyed. Police said specialist advice had established the dogs could never be rehomed due to the violence of their attack. Lucille Downer, a great-grandmother, died after being attacked by the dogs which got into her garden through a hole in the fence on Friday. Police in Northern Ireland have described a second night of violence in a loyalist area as orchestrated, with cars being set alight in order to draw officers in. They were attacked yesterday with petrol bombs during disturbances near Belfast. On Friday, 27 officers were injured after violent protests in Belfast and in Londonderry. From Belfast, our island correspondent John Campbell brings us this report and a warning it contains distressing images.
The police say this violence was orchestrated, with masked men hijacking cars in order to draw them into the area. As officers responded, they were attacked with stones, bottles and petrol bombs. And this is the moment a rioter was engulfed in flames as he seemingly prepared to attack a police vehicle. The fire was quickly extinguished, and it's not yet clear if the man was seriously injured. Tension has been simmering in some Loyalist communities for weeks. They're deeply unhappy at the Northern Ireland part of the Brexit deal. It creates a new trade border with the rest of the UK, and they say that undermines their place in the Union. In a separate development last week, Northern Ireland's Public Prosecution Service decided not to prosecute senior Sinn Féin members who'd attended a large funeral in apparent breach of coronavirus regulations. That provoked outrage among unionist politicians, and some of that sentiment now appears to have spilled onto the streets. Some nationalist politicians say unionist rhetoric has added to community tensions. A senior unionist rejects that.
The violence has to be deplored and it needs to stop. And I know, for example, we have local councillors, local community workers are trying to do what they can to calm fears, to try and get people to go home, to get parents to take responsibility and to get the mostly younger people to disperse.
On Friday night, 15 police officers were hurt when a Loyalist protest in South Belfast turned violent. 7 people have been charged with a riot in connection with that incident, the youngest a boy of just 13. The signs of last night's trouble have been cleared away. Police and politicians are hoping there will be no repeat. John Campbell, BBC News, Belfast.
More than a week after a deadly attack in Mozambique by militants linked to the Islamic State group, many hundreds of people remain missing. It's the latest atrocity in a series of brutally violent attacks in the last few months. It's thought a British man is among dozens killed in the raid in Palma. Thousands were forced to flee by boat to Pemba, from where the BBC's Vuman Mkhize sent this report.
This man has just gotten off the rescue ferry at Pemba Harbour. His tears are for his dead father. His brother is still missing. All morning they arrived, a steady procession of over 1,000 survivors, grateful to be alive, but in shock. They spoke of decapitations, bodies on the streets, and fleeing through dense forests from the gun-wielding insurgents. This distraught woman lost 2 sons during the attack.
It hurts a lot. Every day we saw mothers crying. 3, 4 of their children. They don't know where they are. It's too painful.
ISIS-linked insurgents began the coordinated attack on Palma just over a week ago, killing indiscriminately and displacing thousands. The official death toll is still not yet known, and according to the UN, tens of thousands of people have been displaced. Among those missing is British man Philip Moore. His family fear the worst. As victims made their way out of the besieged town, doctors struggle to keep up with the wounded.
We could not help everybody. I mean, the need is huge there. This population is really in need of medical care, protection, and evacuation, and food.
I'm at a local community sports complex that's been converted into a makeshift shelter for survivors of the deadly attack in Palma. Now, these are some of the victims who have come here seeking shelter and refuge following the horrors that they encountered at the hands of the insurgents.
The people that made their way off the boat are the lucky ones. Thousands remain scattered in the forest surrounding Palma. Many will not survive. And with reports of an ongoing conflict in Palma, Mozambique will struggle to keep up with the escalating humanitarian crisis. Vuman Mkhize, BBC News, Pemba, Mozambique.
Okay, let's catch up with all the sport now. Here's Lizzie Greenwood-Hughes at the BBC Sports Centre. Lizzie.
Hello, Rita. Thank you. Good evening. Cambridge have won both the men's and women's university boat race, continuing their dominance in the famous event, which was staged outside London for the first time since the Second World War. Our correspondent, Katie Gornall, reports.
It's one of sport's most traditional showdowns, but this year, nothing about it looks familiar. Gone is the River Thames lined with fans, in its place a landscape devoid of all the usual landmarks. here on the banks of the Great Ouse, the crews had to make their own atmosphere. Go! The pandemic and the closure of Hammersmith Bridge had forced the change of scenery, giving Cambridge a home advantage, and yet the women's race was nervily close.
Sudden movement and clashing, and this can cause all sorts of problems.
On a straight course, Oxford, on the right, almost veered into Cambridge's path, but the Light Blues fought back and found their rhythm to win for the fourth successive time.
And they have that feeling now, Cambridge across the finish line.
They celebrated wearing white ribbons, worn by both crews to show support for sexual assault victims after allegations recently emerged from Oxford. In the men's race, history had been made before it even started, as Sarah Winkless became its first female umpire. Under her watch, both teams kept their distance to make a powerful start. Without the twists and turns of the Thames, this felt like a sprint to the finish. Cambridge edged in front, and while Oxford pushed them, they couldn't reel them in.
On home water, it is still theirs. Cambridge have the victory.
A double victory then for Cambridge in a year unlike any other. Time to toast a new chapter in this event's storied history. Katie Gornall, BBC News.
Match of the day and sports scene in Scotland follow the news, so don't listen if you want to wait for the football results because they're coming now. It was a day of comebacks in the Premier League. Manchester United beat Brighton 2-1 at Old Trafford, but they're still 14 points behind leaders Manchester City. Elsewhere, Tottenham drew with Newcastle, Fulham lost at Aston Villa, and Southampton beat Burnley. Rangers will play Celtic in the last 16 of the Scottish Cup. They beat the League One side Cove Rangers 4-0 in the third round to set up the Old Firm tie. Chelsea women remain top of the WSL after another huge win, this time 6-0 against Birmingham City, in which Sam Kerr scored her third hat-trick of the season. Chelsea are going for an historic quadruple. Only two British sides will feature in the quarter-finals of rugby's European Champions Cup. Sale will join holders Exeter in the last 8 after they thumped Scarlets 57-14. AJ McGinty scoring 32 of those points for a club record. Edinburgh and Bristol were both knocked out today. And that's the sport. Back to you, Rita.
Thank you, Lizzie. There's more throughout the evening on the BBC News channel. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Good night.